The first thing people noticed was not the sound. It was the pressure, a low, bone-deep vibration that moved through the floor before anyone heard the rotors. Coffee cups rattled on countertops. The overhead fluorescents flickered twice. A cardiac monitor swung on its mount. And then the windows of Haverfield General Hospital's trauma bay turned white with rotor wash, and every person inside that emergency room looked up at the same time, because two Black Hawk helicopters had just dropped out of the night sky and were setting down on the rooftop helipad with the kind of precision that didn't belong to any commercial medevac operator. People said later that what happened next lasted only about 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, a side door to the trauma bay burst open, and 6 men came through it wearing tactical gear with no unit insignia, carrying a 7th man on a military stretcher. The man on the stretcher was bleeding from at least 3 sites. His uniform was cut open at the chest. His face was the color of old concrete. The men carrying him moved the way soldiers moved, low, fast, with the economy of people who had practiced this under worse conditions than a hospital hallway. And they did not slow down when they hit the ER threshold. Every doctor in that room took a step forward. The man leading the team, big, dark-eyed, with a jaw that looked like it had been through a wall more than once, swept his gaze across the trauma bay, past the attending physicians, past the senior nurses gathered at the central station, past the residents who had already started toward the stretcher with gloved hands raised. He stopped looking when he reached the back of the room. "Phoenix," he said. Not a question, not a request. A statement aimed at someone specific. "I know you're in here." The room went so quiet that you could hear the IV pumps beeping. Then, slowly, one of the nurses at the back of the trauma bay lowered the chart she had been holding. She was not the tallest person in the room. She was not the most decorated, not the most credentialed, not the one whose name appeared on the hospital's recognition wall or whose photo sat in the quarterly newsletter. She was 29 years old, with dark circles under her eyes from a double shift and a paper coffee cup balanced on the counter beside her that had gone cold 3 hours ago. She wore her hair back in a knot that was starting to come loose. Her scrubs had a bleach stain near the left pocket that she'd been meaning to replace for 2 months. She looked at the man with the dark eyes. She looked at the man bleeding on the stretcher. She reached up, very deliberately, and pulled the left sleeve of her scrub top down another inch. Her name was Nora Voss. She had worked at Haverfield General for 6 years. Before that, nobody at the hospital knew much about her, and she had never volunteered the information. There was a brief mention on her intake paperwork of prior military medical experience, a line that the HR coordinator had glanced at and moved past because Nora hadn't made anything of it, and neither did anyone else. What nobody at Haverfield knew was that before she was Nora Voss, ER nurse, she had been Petty Officer 2nd Class Voss, attached to a special operations element that didn't appear on any official Navy roster. Her call sign had been Phoenix, and she had earned it over 4 deployments doing the thing she was best at, which was keeping people alive in conditions where everything in the environment was trying to kill them. She had never told anyone at the hospital, not a single person. The decision to leave the military had not been clean. It had not been a ceremony and a handshake and a grateful walk toward civilian life. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in a field hospital overseas, sitting outside a trauma tent with her hands still shaking an hour after she stopped working on a teammate who didn't make it, and deciding quietly that she could not keep being the person who was supposed to bring everyone home. She came back to the States. She finished her RN degree. She'd been working toward it on and off for years. She applied to Haverfield General because it was far from every military installation she'd ever worked near. She kept her past in a box, and she kept the box closed, and for 6 years she had been very, very good at being invisible. She covered the tattoo on her left wrist, the unit insignia, small and faded now, just dark lines against her skin, with the sleeve of her scrubs every morning before she walked into the hospital. It had become as automatic as putting on her badge. She did it without thinking about it. She was thinking about it now. "Dr. Reeves," she said, setting her chart down, "I need you to move." Garrett Reeves, the attending physician who had already positioned himself at the head of the stretcher, turned to look at her. He was 10 years her senior and 4 pay grades above her on the hospital org chart, and he had the expression of a man who was used to people asking him things, not telling him things. "Excuse me? I'm not going to say it again." She was already at the stretcher, her hands finding the injured man's wrist. Pulse thready, skin clammy. She pulled the sheet back, looked at the wound sites, and felt her mind shift into a gear that it hadn't used in years. Clean, fast, stripped of everything except what mattered. The SEAL commander was beside her. Up close, she recognized him. Damien Coyle. She had last seen him in a place she was not going to name out loud, on a night she had spent years trying to compress into something manageable. "Voss," he said quietly. "I see him," she said. She did not stop moving. "How long?" 42 minutes since exfil. Before that, don't need before that, right now. She looked at the chest rise. Wrong. She looked at the skin around the wound sites. The discoloration was wrong. She looked at the angle of the entry wound and felt something lock into place in her chest. "He's tamponating," she said. "Not to Coyle, not to anyone in particular. Someone get me a 14 gauge, now." "The patient needs imaging first," Dr. Reeves said. "We don't know the full—" "He'll be dead before imaging." She said it without raising her voice, which was somehow worse than yelling. "Pericardial tamponade. Fluid is compressing the heart. If we move him to imaging right now, we will lose him in the hallway. I need a 14-gauge needle. I need a 60 ml syringe. I need an ultrasound cart, if one is available in the next 30 seconds. And if it's not, I need everyone to get out of my way and let me work." The room held its breath. Dr. Reeves stared at her. The SEAL commander did not stare at anyone. He simply said very quietly, "You heard her." Here is what nobody knew about Nora Voss. Not even the younger nurses who liked her and sometimes brought her extra coffee on long shifts. She had performed a pericardiocentesis 3 times in the field. Once in a vehicle that was still moving. Once in a dust storm that reduced visibility to about 4 feet. Once in complete darkness, by feel alone, with another medic talking her through it over a radio that kept cutting out. None of those 3 men had died on her table. She did not think about them while she worked. Thinking about outcomes was the fastest way to compromise technique. What she thought about, what she'd trained herself to think about, was the procedure, the anatomy, the needle angle, the feel of resistance, and then the release. The ultrasound cart arrived. She had the image she needed in under 15 seconds. She positioned the needle. She exhaled. "Voss," Coyle said from behind her, not because he was worried, but because he was watching. "I've got him," she said. She did the procedure. The monitor changed immediately. The heart rhythm, which had been ugly and irregular, smoothed into something that was still damaged but was alive. The man on the stretcher took a breath that filled his lungs all the way, for the first time in who knew how long. The room exhaled. Dr. Reeves said nothing for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "We need to get him to OR." "Yes," Nora said. "He's also got a bleed in his abdomen, probably splenic. Get Dr. Anand down here now, not in 10 minutes. She stripped her gloves. Her hands were not shaking. They had not shaken once. "And someone needs to give him 2 units of O-neg while we move." She stepped back. The team moved around her, taking over the logistics of transport the way teams did when they finally knew what they were doing. Coyle stood where he was, watching her. She met his eyes for half a second. Then she looked away and picked up a fresh pair of gloves, because there were other patients in this ER, and they didn't stop needing care because a helicopter had landed on the roof. She had already known it was going to be a bad shift before the Blackhawks arrived. It had started at 7 in the morning with a 3-vehicle accident on the highway overpass, which sent 4 patients in simultaneously, one of whom was a 6-year-old who had been in the back seat. The 6-year-old had made it. The driver of the 3rd vehicle had not, and Nora had been the one to tell his wife, who had arrived in the waiting room still in her work uniform. That conversation had lasted 6 minutes and had taken something out of her that she hadn't gotten back by the time the shift hit hour 8. Hour 8 was when Dr. Elliot Marsh walked into the department. Marsh was the ER medical director. He had been in that role for 14 months, brought in from a larger metropolitan hospital with the apparent mandate to improve efficiency metrics. He had, in Nora's assessment, improved the efficiency metrics by doing things that made the numbers look better while making the medicine worse. Shorter assessment windows, narrower triage protocols, a recent directive about limiting diagnostic imaging for low-complexity presentations that had resulted in 2 missed diagnoses in the past 3 months that she knew about personally. She had raised the issue. Twice. In writing, once, which was how she preferred to communicate things that she wanted on record. The response had been a meeting with her nursing supervisor, Karen Platt, during which Karen had used the phrases team alignment, scope of practice, and constructive channels in a way that made it clear the message Nora was supposed to receive was, stop. She had not stopped. She had filed a second complaint, this time with the Hospital Quality Review Office, and she had CC'd her nursing supervisor on it because she believed in transparency even when transparency was uncomfortable. That had been 2 weeks ago. Today, Elliot Marsh walked into the ER at hour 8 of her shift and pulled Karen Platt aside near the nurses' station. And the two of them talked for 4 minutes in the kind of low-register voice that meant they did not want the conversation overheard. Nora noticed because she noticed everything in a trauma bay. It was a reflex she had built over years in environments where missing a detail could kill someone. But she did not stop what she was doing, which was completing a discharge summary on a 60-year-old with a kidney stone. At minute 4 of that conversation, Karen Platt walked over to her. "Nora, can I see you for a second? I'm in the middle of a discharge. It'll take a minute." She finished the note, saved it, and followed Karen to the small office off the main hallway that served as the charge nurse's base of operations. Marsh was already inside. He had his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "We're going to make some adjustments to your schedule," he said. Nora looked at him. "What kind of adjustments?" "Temporary reassignment. We're moving you to outpatient infusion for the next rotation." Outpatient infusion. It was not the worst department in the hospital. It was also approximately as far as you could get from emergency medicine while remaining in the same building. It was the place they sent nurses when they needed to move them without the paperwork of a formal disciplinary action. "Because of the quality complaint," she said. "Because of scheduling needs," Karen said, and her voice had that practiced evenness that meant she knew exactly what this was and had decided not to call it by its name. "I've been in emergency medicine for 6 years," Nora said. "I have a competency record that you could look at if you wanted to." "This is not a reflection on your competency," Marsh said. "Then what is it a reflection on?" He met her eyes. He was not a man who was used to being asked direct questions by nurses, and she could see the small recalibration happening behind his expression. "It reflects a need," he said carefully, "to ensure that the team is functioning as a cohesive unit. When individual staff members pursue actions outside of established channels, I used established channels. I filed through the Quality Review Office." "Nora." Karen's voice had gone soft in a way that was meant to signal sympathy, but felt more like a warning. "This is not the place for this." "I'd like to know when the place for this is," Nora said. "Because I raised a concern about patient safety, using the process that exists for raising concerns about patient safety. And the outcome of that process appears to be that I'm being reassigned to a different department." Marsh said, "The outcome is that we're making a scheduling adjustment, that's all." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. Well, she had meant it when she said all right. Not because she agreed with what was happening. She didn't, and she was already mentally drafting the follow-up she intended to send to the Quality Review Office before the end of the week. But because she was familiar with the particular kind of institutional pressure that expressed itself through scheduling adjustments and scope of practice conversations, and the careful use of the word team. She had encountered it before, in a different context, with different people wearing different clothes. The mechanism was the same. You pushed back directly, you lost ground. You documented everything and let the process run its course, and you stayed visible, and you did not give them the exit they were quietly hoping you would take. She finished her shift. She did not take a long break. She covered for Jacinta Myers when Jacinta needed to step out because her babysitter had called, which meant Nora also handled the sepsis case in Bay 4 that technically should have been Jacinta's, and she did it well. And at the end of it, she charted everything carefully and filed her shift notes and was getting her bag from her locker when she heard the first vibration come up through the floor. She paused with her hand on the locker door. The vibration came again, and this time it was accompanied by something she recognized from a very specific set of years in her life. The particular sound signature of military rotors, not medevac, not commercial, but the heavier, more deliberate sound of Blackhawks operating at low altitude and descending fast. She thought, "That's unusual." She thought, "That's very unusual." She put her bag back in the locker. She took out her access badge. She walked back toward the trauma bay, because she had spent enough of her life running toward sound signatures like that to find it genuinely difficult to walk in the other direction. She had been back at the nurse's station for approximately 90 seconds when the door came open and Damien Coyle walked through it. I was older, obviously. She had not seen him in more than 4 years, and those had not been quiet years for either of them, if she had to guess. He had more gray at his temples than she remembered. There was a new scar along the left side of his jaw that hadn't been there before. He moved the same way, with that quality of compact readiness that certain people carried their whole lives and never quite put down. But something had changed in his face. Something had gotten heavier. She recognized him immediately. She was almost certain he recognized her at the same moment, because she saw it happen. His eyes moved across the room with the automatic efficiency of a man doing a threat assessment, and when they landed on her, they stopped. "Phoenix," he said, and every plan she had about staying invisible walked out the door. The man on the stretcher. She would learn later that his name was Warrant Officer Dav Mercer, that he had been on an extraction in a location she was not going to be told about, and that the injury had occurred during the kind of operation that didn't generate official incident reports. Stabilized in the OR within 90 minutes of arriving. Dr. Priya Anand, the trauma surgeon who took over once they got him upstairs, came back down afterward and found Nora at the nurse's station. "That pericardiocentesis," she said, without preamble. "You called that in the trauma bay?" "Yes." "Without ultrasound confirmation?" "I had the confirmation within 30 seconds of starting the approach. I didn't perform the procedure without it." Priya Anand looked at her for a moment. She was a compact, precise woman who spoke in measurements and probabilities and did not often express surprise, but she had the look of someone revising an assessment. "He would not have made it to the OR," she said. "I know." "Where did you train?" Nora said, "Around." Priya looked at her for another moment, and then she said, "I'm going to need a full account of your assessment process for the incident report. I'll have it to you by end of shift. You're off shift. I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning." Damien Coyle found her at 11:47 at night, sitting in the hospital's small courtyard with a fresh cup of coffee that had already started going cold. She heard him coming. Old habit, she tracked footsteps without trying, and she did not look up. He sat in the chair across from her. For a moment they just existed in the same space with the particular silence of two people who had, at one point, known exactly what the other person was going to do before they did it. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." "You've been here since 7 this morning." "I know when I got here." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the ground. She studied his profile without being obvious about it. The scar on his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "How did you know we'd be here?" she asked. "We didn't. We were diverted. Haverfield was the closest level 1. He paused. "And I pulled your record 6 months ago. I knew where you were." She looked at him. "Don't," he said. "Don't make that face. I wasn't surveilling you. I just needed to know you were okay." "Were you satisfied?" "I was until I read the HR memo about your schedule reassignment." His voice had gone flat in a way that meant he was choosing his words. "You filed a patient safety complaint." "I did." "And they moved you to a different department." "They're calling it a scheduling adjustment." Coyle made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "They always call it something." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was barely warm. "It doesn't matter. The complaint is on record. The quality review process has timelines. I'll follow up." "Nora, I'm not going to, if that's what you're working up to saying." "It's not what I'm working up to saying." I was quiet for a moment. "Mercer's alive. Because of you. Because of the surgical team. Because of you." He said it without emphasis, just correction. "The surgical team had him because of you. You know how that works." She did know. She had always known how that worked. It was one of the things that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't worked in tactical medicine. The chain of decisions, each one dependent on the one before it, so that sometimes the most important intervention in a patient's survival happened 45 minutes before anyone operated, in a hallway, by someone who read a presentation correctly when everyone else was still talking about protocol. "What do you want, Damien?" she asked. "Right now? Nothing. I wanted to see you with my own eyes." He sat back. "Mercer's going to be transferred tomorrow morning. His family's been notified." "Good. Before we go—" He stopped, started again. "What they're doing to you, the reassignment, the retaliation." He was careful with the word. I have some people I can make a call to. Don't. Nora, I'm not asking you to fight this for me. She met his eyes, and she held them. I have never asked anyone to fight anything for me. Not once in my life. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. Like he was seeing something he'd suspected all along. No, he said. You haven't. She stood up. She picked up the cold coffee and tossed it in the recycling bin near the courtyard entrance. Get some sleep, she said, and thank you for the diversion. I mean it. However it happened, thank you. She went back inside. The hospital at midnight was a different institution than the hospital at noon. The lighting shifted to something lower. The foot traffic thinned. The particular variety of controlled chaos that defined the daytime ER settled into something quieter and stranger, the pace of a place that did not stop but breathed differently in the dark. Nora was not supposed to still be here. She was not supposed to be sitting at the nurse's station on a shift she had technically clocked out of, reviewing the incident report Priya Anand had requested. But here was the thing about Nora Voss that nobody had ever quite figured out. Not her supervisors, not her colleagues, not the institutional machinery that had spent the last 2 weeks trying to move her sideways. She did not leave things unfinished. She finished the incident report. She filed it. She was logging out of the system when her phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at it. Unknown number. Text message. 5 words. You need to see this. Then a photo. She opened it. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was a photograph of a document, a hospital record, she thought at first, but then she looked closer, and it wasn't a patient record. It was an incident summary, dated 14 months ago, just before Elliot Marsh had arrived at Haverfield General. It was a summary of an adverse event in the emergency department, an adverse event that, according to the summary, had been reviewed, assessed, and closed. She had never seen this document before. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment with her phone in her hand, because the adverse event summary described a patient, 63 years old, presenting with chest pain, referred by the ER attending for lower priority workup, who had died from a missed STEMI 4 hours after presenting. And the reviewing body, according to this document, had found no fault. The care had been deemed appropriate. But the attending listed on the incident summary was not the attending who had been working that night. She knew that because she had been working that night. She had been in that ER. And she remembered the patient, not by name, but by the sequence of events, because she had flagged his presentation to the attending twice before her shift ended, and the attending who had been there was not the name on this document. The name on this document was hers. Her name had been placed on an incident report for an adverse event she had not been involved in. She stared at her phone in the midnight quiet of an empty nurse's station and thought about the quality complaint she had filed. She thought about the scheduling adjustment that wasn't a scheduling adjustment. She thought about the way Elliot Marsh had looked at her in that office and chosen his words very carefully and not quite met her eyes. She thought about the fact that someone, somewhere, had her personal cell phone number and had just sent her a photograph of a document she had no reason to know existed. And she thought about the fact that the photograph had metadata. If she looked at the metadata, she might know where it was taken and when. If she knew where it was taken, she might know who took it. If she knew who took it, she put her phone face down on the desk. She picked it up again. She was still sitting there at 12:37 in the morning when a sound reached her from the direction of the rooftop. Not helicopters this time, not rotors, but something quieter. Something that resolved, after a moment, into footsteps in the stairwell. Multiple sets of footsteps. Moving with purpose. Moving toward the ER floor. She put the phone in her scrub pocket and stood up. The footsteps in the stairwell were not hurried, which was in some ways more unsettling than if they had been. Hurried footsteps in a hospital stairwell at 12:30 in the morning meant a code, an emergency, someone running to something they needed to reach. Deliberate footsteps meant something else. Deliberate footsteps at that hour meant whoever was coming had planned to be here at exactly this time. She counted 3 sets, maybe 4. She moved to the edge of the nurse's station and positioned herself so she could see the stairwell door without being the first thing visible from it, and she waited. And she did not touch anything or reach for anything, just stood with her weight balanced and her hands loose at her sides in a way that she had not stood in years but that her body remembered without being asked. The door opened. 2 men in hospital security uniforms came through it. Behind them was Elliot Marsh in street clothes, dark jacket, no tie, which meant he had come back to the hospital after going home, which meant someone had called him, which meant something had changed since the conversation in Karen Platt's office that afternoon. Behind Marsh was a man she did not recognize. Mid-50s, gray suit that had probably been expensive about 5 years ago, a leather folio under one arm. He had the look of a man who spent a lot of time in rooms where things were decided and very little time anywhere that required him to be uncomfortable. Marsh saw her immediately. He stopped. "Ms. Voss," he said. The formality of it, not Nora, not her usual address, told her everything about the register of this conversation before it started. "I didn't expect you to still be here." "I had an incident report to finish," she said, "at this hour." The report had a timeline. The man in the gray suit stepped forward slightly. He had a way of moving that suggested he considered himself the most important person in any room he entered, not out of arrogance exactly, more out of long habit. "I'm Gerald Fitch," he said. "I'm an attorney representing the hospital's administrative board." "All right," she said. "We need to have a conversation with you." "I gathered that." Fitch glanced at Marsh, then back at her. "Ms. Voss, we've become aware that you've been in possession of certain internal hospital documents that were obtained without authorization." She looked at him. "What documents?" "I think you know what documents." "I'd prefer you to be specific." The two security guards had positioned themselves on either side of the stairwell door. It was probably meant to feel authoritative. It felt more like theater, because she had been in situations where the security presence was real, and these two men, one of whom she recognized, Eddie Cartwright, who spent most night shifts watching highlight reels on his phone at the lobby desk, were not it. Marsh said, "This doesn't have to be complicated, Nora. If you receive something that was sent to you without authorization, the right thing is to return it, and I haven't received anything without authorization," she said. "We have reason to believe I received a text message from an unknown number approximately 40 minutes ago. The text contained an image. I looked at the image." She kept her voice even. "If someone sent me something, I didn't request it. I didn't solicit it. I received it. That's a different thing." Fitch said, "Where is your phone?" "In my pocket." "We'd like to—" "No," she said, simply. No escalation, no apology, just the word and a direct look. Fitch blinked. "You can speak with my representative," she said, "and you should probably know that if you're here at 12:30 in the morning in street clothes, with a lawyer who does administrative work rather than employment law, something happened tonight that you're very worried about, which means I should probably be talking to someone too before this conversation goes any further." She picked up her bag from under the desk. "Good night, Mr. Fitch," she said. "Dr. Marsh." She walked toward the exit. Nobody physically stopped her. She had not expected them to, because despite everything, this was still a hospital and not a place where the people involved had that kind of authority. But she felt Marsh's eyes on her back as she went, and she felt the particular quality of a situation that had just moved from complicated to something worse than complicated. And she pushed out through the double doors into the night air and stood for a moment in the ambulance bay with her bag on her shoulder and her phone in her hand, and thought about her next move very carefully. She called her sister first. Not because her sister could help with any of this. Bridget lived in Portland and worked in landscape architecture and had very little experience with hospital administrative law, but because it was almost 1 in the morning and Nora had spent the last 17 hours in sustained crisis mode, and she needed to hear a voice that had nothing to do with any of this. Bridget picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep, which meant she had probably been reading and had fallen into one of those late-night spirals she never admitted to. "It's late," Bridget said. "I know." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I just needed—" She stopped. Reorganized. "I had a long shift. I saw on the news there were military helicopters at your hospital." "Yeah." "Are you involved in that?" "Marginally," she said, which was probably the most dramatic understatement she had ever delivered in a casual conversation. Bridget made a sound that suggested she didn't believe the word marginally for a second, but was choosing not to press. "Come stay this weekend," she said. "I have that extra room and I bought an embarrassing amount of Thai food that I will not finish alone." Nora almost said yes right then. She thought about Portland. She thought about the extra room at Bridget's apartment and not having to make any decisions that had consequences. "Maybe," she said. "I'll let you know." She hung up and stood in the ambulance bay for another minute, long enough to watch a transport van pull in on the far end and two paramedics climb out moving slowly, because their patient was stable and there was no reason to hurry. She watched them in the way she had always watched people doing the job, with the particular attention of someone who understood every movement. Then she took out her phone and opened the photo again. Well, the thing about the incident report was not just that her name was on it. The thing was the date, 14 months ago, which was when Elliot Marsh had arrived at Haverfield General. He had come from Sutter Ridge Medical Center in Sacramento, brought in by the board with what was described in the hospital newsletter as a mandate to optimize departmental performance. She had read the newsletter at the time with the mild interest she gave to most institutional communications and had thought nothing further about it. But if this incident report existed, if her name had been placed on a document describing an adverse event she hadn't been involved in at approximately the same time Marsh arrived, then either someone had made a clerical error significant enough to require 14 months of correction, or someone had done something deliberate. She photographed the photograph with a different device. She sent the image to an email address she kept for exactly this kind of documentation, a personal account she had created 2 years ago during a different professional dispute, one she had eventually won, and which she maintained on the principle that it costs nothing to be organized. She sent it to that address, attached a brief description of when and how she had received it, and then she cleared the original from her phone's message thread while keeping the metadata intact, which required 3 specific steps that she had learned from a compliance officer she had worked with during her second year at Haverfield. She was not destroying evidence. She was preserving it in a location that could not be compelled from her without process. Then she walked to her car in the hospital parking structure, sat in the driver's seat for a minute without starting the engine, and made one more call. "I need a name," she said when the line picked up. "Employment attorney, hospital administration cases, someone who doesn't need the situation," explained slowly. She did not sleep well, which she had expected. She slept in the fragmented way she sometimes did after operationally dense days. 2 hours, then awake, then another hour, then awake again. Each interval interrupted by the kind of almost dreaming that was less rest than her brain running maintenance routines on things she hadn't finished processing. She was up at 5:45. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and she built a document, clean, chronological, sourced, that started with the quality complaint she had filed 2 weeks ago and worked backward through every relevant interaction she had logged in her work journal. She had kept a work journal for the past 3 years, not because she had anticipated needing it, but because she was the kind of person who processed things by writing them down, and because she had learned during her time in the military that the things you documented were the only things that existed in an official sense when someone later told a different story. At 7:15, she received a text from an unknown number, a different unknown number than the previous one, that said only, "K. Platt. Be careful." She stared at that for a long time. Karen Platt had been her nursing supervisor for 4 years. Karen was not cruel, exactly. She was the kind of institutional person who had made her accommodations with the institution and had stopped noticing that she'd made them. Nora had always categorized her as someone who would not help, but also would not actively harm. The text suggested that categorization might need revision. She added it to the document. She noted the time, the number, the content. She saved the document to 3 locations. Then she got dressed, and she drove to Haverfield General, and she showed up for the first day of her reassignment to the outpatient infusion center with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her work journal in her bag, because whatever was happening behind the institutional walls of this hospital, she was not going to give anyone the additional leverage of an unexcused absence. The outpatient infusion center occupied the 3rd floor of the hospital's east wing, a quieter, more measured environment than the ER, which was the point of sending her there, she understood. Infusion was scheduled, predictable, low acuity in the emergency sense. Patients came in on appointments. The clinical complexity was real, but the chaos was managed. For someone who had spent 6 years in an environment that operated on controlled chaos, it was the equivalent of being handed a crossword puzzle after years of field operations. She did not say this to anyone. She showed up. She introduced herself to the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia Sung, who gave her a long and not particularly friendly look before assigning her a patient bay. She did her job. She was competent and thorough, and she did not give Patricia Sung or anyone else any reason to add anything to whatever narrative was being assembled about her. At 11:30, one of the infusion patients, a 61-year-old man named Mr. Delacroix, who was receiving his fourth round of chemotherapy and had the particular kind of weary pragmatism that came from having dealt with medical bureaucracy for months, looked at her over the top of his reading glasses and said, "You look like someone who belongs somewhere else." "I'm right where I'm supposed to be," she said. He went back to his book. Then, without looking up, "I had a nurse like you once, in the oncology unit, years ago. She was too good for the floor she was on, and everyone knew it, and nobody said anything, and eventually she left and went somewhere that deserved her." Nora adjusted his infusion rate without responding. "I'm not saying this to make conversation," Mr. Delacroix said. "I'm saying it because I'm 61, and I've had cancer twice, and I no longer have time to say things only to make conversation." She looked at him. "Are you comfortable? Any nausea?" "Some. Manageable." He looked back at his book. "Don't let them make you small." She held that for a moment. Then she moved to the next bay. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Patricia Sung appeared at the door of the bay where Nora was documenting a flow rate adjustment and said, in a voice that was neutral to the point of deliberateness, "Dr. Marsh would like to see you." Nora saved her note. "Now?" He said, "When you have a moment." She had learned what that phrase meant. She had heard it enough times from enough people in enough institutional context to know that when convenient and when you have a moment were always covers for immediately, and there is no choice in this. She followed Patricia down the hall and took the elevator to the administrative floor, and she walked into Marsh's office to find that he was not alone. Gerald Fitch was there again, this time with a second attorney, younger, with a laptop open on the conference table in the corner of the office. Karen Platt was there too, sitting in the chair nearest the window, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. Marsh closed the door after Nora came in. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." A small silence. Fitch glanced at the younger attorney, then at Marsh. "Ms. Voss," Marsh said, and she noticed he was back to Ms. Voss now, same formal register as last night, which told her this was on record somehow. "We need to address some serious concerns that have emerged in the past 24 hours. All right. It's come to the attention of the board that there may have been an unauthorized disclosure of protected hospital documentation. We have reason to believe that you may have been the recipient of materials obtained by someone with internal access, and that you may have taken steps to transmit or store those materials." She said nothing. "If that's the case," Fitch said, stepping in, "the hospital is prepared to treat this as a confidential matter, resolved internally, provided you're willing to—" "Provided I'm willing to what?" she asked. Fitch looked at her steadily. "Provide your cooperation in identifying the source of the disclosure, return any materials in your possession, and agree to a separation from the hospital under terms that would be mutually satisfactory." The word separation landed in the room with a particular weight. She looked at Karen Platt. Karen was still looking at the middle distance. "You want me to resign," Nora said. "We want this resolved," Marsh said. "That's all." "And if I resign, what happens to the quality complaint I filed?" "The complaint process would be—" "I want you to say it." Marsh's jaw tightened. "The investigation would be closed, because there's no longer an active employee with standing to pursue it." "Nora." Karen finally spoke, and her voice had the quality of someone who had made a decision they hadn't entirely made peace with. "Please just—" "Don't," Nora said. It came out quieter than she expected. Not angry, just final. "Don't tell me to please just anything." She looked at Marsh. She looked at Fitch. She looked at the younger attorney who was typing something and not meeting her eyes. "I'm not going to resign," she said. "If you want to terminate my employment, that's your prerogative, and I will respond to it through the appropriate legal process. If you want to continue the scheduling reassignment as a response to a protected complaint, I'll respond to that through the same process. And if there's a document in your hospital system with my name on an adverse event I was not involved in, you should talk to whoever created that document before this gets any further along." Complete silence. She watched Marsh's face. She watched the moment when something in it shifted, because she had named the specific thing that they hadn't said she knew about, and now he knew she knew, and the calculation changed. "That will be all," she said, and she walked out of the office. And she did not close the door too hard or too softly. She just let it close at its own pace, because she was not going to perform anything in this hallway. She was back in the infusion center by 1:53. She finished her shift. She checked on Mr. Delacroix before his infusion completed, confirmed his vitals were stable, went through the discharge instructions with the composure of someone who had not just told 3 hospital administrators and 2 attorneys that she was not going anywhere. At 4:15, as she was completing her end-of-shift documentation, her phone buzzed. It was a number she recognized this time. Priya Anand. She answered. "Mercer is awake," Priya said without preamble. "He's asking for you." She absorbed that. "How is he?" "Stable, cranky. Told the post-op nurse she had the IV placement of a distracted undergrad, which I'm told is high praise from his unit." "That's a yes," Nora confirmed. "He specifically said Phoenix." Priya paused. "I didn't ask what that means." "Good call. Are you coming?" She looked at the clock. She looked at the documentation she had to finish. She thought about the administrative floor and the attorneys and the particular silence of Karen Platt staring at a wall. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming." Dave Mercer looked like what he was, which was a man who had been seriously hurt and was in the first uncomfortable stage of not being in immediate danger anymore, where the adrenaline had worn off and the pain had settled in and the body was making all its adjustments, and none of them felt good. He was propped up at a slight angle, monitoring leads on his chest, left arm in a surgical dressing, face the color of old paper. He was also, despite all of this, completely alert. And when she came through the door, his eyes went to her immediately, with the kind of focus that did not come from painkillers. "There she is," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot, and then someone put a needle in my chest." He shifted, grimaced, stopped shifting. "Coyle told me what happened down in the bay, when I came in. Don't worry about that." "I'm not worried. I just wanted to say thank you." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way people from that background said serious things, directly, briefly, and then it was said. You knew what was wrong before anyone else. It was a readable presentation. Coyle said you took control of the room. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat, because she was tired and her feet had been on a hard floor for 9 hours and she was done performing standing. Coyle has a tendency to editorialize. Mercer almost smiled. It looked like it hurt. "Yeah, he does." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you in trouble here?" She looked at him. "Don't tell me it's not my business," he said. "I've been shot. I get to ask intrusive questions." "I'm in a dispute with the hospital administration," she said. "It'll work out." "What kind of dispute?" She looked at him for a moment. He had the specific quality of attention that people developed in environments where accurate information was the difference between outcomes. Not nosiness, not curiosity, but the habit of actually wanting to know what was true. "I filed a patient safety complaint," she said. "They want me to go away instead of addressing it." Mercer said nothing for a moment. "And there's more than that." "Probably," she said. "I'm still figuring out how much more." He looked at the ceiling. His breathing was slow and deliberate, the pace of someone managing pain rather than relieved of it. "Coyle's still in the building," he said. "He doesn't leave until I transfer." "I know." "He could—" Mercer. She said it the way she would have said it on a different kind of field, years ago. Just his name, with enough weight in it to stop the sentence. "I'm not going to use your unit's leverage to solve a hospital HR problem. That's not what this is." He was quiet. "But I appreciate it," she said. "Genuinely." He nodded slowly. "Okay." Then after a pause, "For what it's worth, what you did last night, the procedure, the way you ran that room." He stopped, looked at her. "There was never any question in my mind why your call sign was what it was." She did not say anything for a moment. Then, "Get some sleep. Your transfer is in the morning." "Voss?" "Yes." "Whatever they're trying to do to you." He stopped, adjusted, chose the shorter version. "Don't let them." She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time, this man who had almost died on a stretcher in her ER, who was awake and cranky and telling a surgical nurse she had the IV technique of a distracted undergrad, who had looked her in the eyes and said what he meant without wrapping it in anything. "I'm not planning to," she said. She found Coyle in the hallway outside the surgical recovery wing, leaning against the wall with his arms folded and a paper cup of vending machine coffee in one hand, looking exactly like the person he was. A man who did not belong in a hospital hallway, but was prepared to exist in one for as long as necessary. He looked at her when she came out. "He's good," she said. "I know, I checked 20 minutes ago." "Then why are you still here?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cup in his hand, then back at her. "I know what Fitch was doing in Marsh's office this afternoon," he said. She stopped. "How?" "Because Haverfield General's Administrative Board has a member who sits on a federal oversight committee, and that committee interacts with certain offices I have clearance to contact." He said it simply, no drama. "Fitch made 2 calls before he came to see you this morning. One of them was to the board member. The other was to the hospital's malpractice carrier." "They're preparing to bury something," she said. "That's my read." She thought about the incident report, the date, her name where it shouldn't be. "Marsh has been here 14 months, she said, "and came from Sutter Ridge." She looked at him sharply. "I had time while Mercer was in surgery," Coyle said, without apology. Sutter Ridge had 3 adverse event complaints in the 8 months before Marsh left. All 3 were closed internally. One of the nurses involved in the first complaint transferred to a different department 2 months before Marsh's departure was announced. The pattern was not subtle. It was also, she thought, the kind of pattern that was easy to look past when each piece of it was separated from the others by institutional distance. A different department here, a closed complaint there, a personnel record that showed a transfer rather than a termination. But when you put the pieces in the same room, they told a story. "If there's a document with my name on an adverse event I had nothing to do with," she said slowly, "and if there are 3 closed complaints from his last position that followed the same structure, then someone was very careful," Coyle said, "and has been for a long time." She stood in the hallway and thought about this, about the 17 hours she had just worked, about the attorney she was calling in the morning, about Mr. Delacroix and his book and his 2 rounds of cancer, and the way he had looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Don't let them make you small." About the text she had received at 12:30 in the morning from someone inside this hospital who had taken a risk to send it. "I need to know who sent that photo," she said. "I know. Can you help with that without making this into something that requires a security clearance to understand?" He considered this. "Probably." "Then help with that," she said. "Nothing else." He nodded. He drank the last of the terrible vending machine coffee and didn't react to how bad it was, which she thought said something characteristically accurate about him. "I'll have something for you by morning," he said. She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Mercer's alive," he said, "and because 14 months ago, when my unit was in a position I'm not going to describe, the person who got us out of it was not a general or a contractor or anyone who had the authority to make the decision she made." He held her eyes. "It was you. And you knew what it would cost you, and you made the call anyway. So." He straightened up. He dropped the empty cup in a nearby waste bin. "So," he said again, and that was apparently the entirety of the explanation. She watched him go back down the hall toward the recovery wing. She stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light of a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular variety of institutional time that moved differently here than it did anywhere else. Then her phone buzzed. Not a call. A push notification from the hospital's internal system, which she was not supposed to still have access to because her reassignment should have restricted her system permissions, which meant someone either hadn't processed the restriction yet or had deliberately left it open. The notification was a flag on a patient record, not a current patient, a historical record, 18 months old, flagged by the Quality Review Office as part of an audit. She had submitted a complaint 2 weeks ago. She opened the notification. The record it referenced was for a 67-year-old woman. Chest pain presentation, referred for lower priority workup, deteriorated in the waiting area. Outcome listed as adverse. The attending of record was Elliot Marsh, but the note appended to the record, added 3 days after the initial documentation, she could see the timestamp, listed the assessing nurse as Nora Voss. She had not been working that shift either. She had checked her own scheduling records that morning. She could prove she had not been in the building. 2 records, 2 different patients, 2 different dates, her name on both of them. She was standing in a hospital hallway staring at her phone with the very specific feeling of someone who has just understood the shape of something that is much larger than they initially thought, when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened and Karen Platt stepped out of it. Karen stopped when she saw Nora. They looked at each other across 20 feet of hallway. Karen had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, which meant she was leaving for the night. And her face had the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight had become its own kind of posture. She took one step toward Nora, then stopped. She opened her mouth. Then, from somewhere in the east wing, an alarm sounded. Not a code alarm, not cardiac, but the specific three-tone sequence that meant a security event in progress. And every light in the hallway snapped to a colder, brighter register, and Karen's face went completely still, and Nora heard footsteps again, moving fast this time, moving from the direction of the administrative corridor, and whatever Karen Platt had been about to say was lost in the sudden and complete transformation of the hallway into something that was no longer quiet. Karen Platt's mouth closed. Whatever she had been about to say sealed itself behind her lips with the particular finality of a decision made under pressure, and then the footsteps from the administrative corridor resolved into three people moving fast. Not running, but the controlled quick walk of people who had been told to get somewhere without creating a scene, and Nora recognized two of them. Fitch, still in the gray suit, looking less composed than he had that afternoon. Behind him, a younger man she didn't know, carrying a laptop bag and a phone pressed to his ear. Behind that man, someone new, a woman in a dark blazer with a lanyard that read, Haverfield General, Compliance Office. They were not moving toward Nora. They were moving toward the administrative elevator, and they were moving with the specific energy of people who had just received information that required them to be somewhere else immediately. Nora looked at Karen. Karen looked back at her, and her face had shifted into something that was harder to read than the careful blankness of the past 2 days. It was closer to exhaustion, the kind that lived behind the eyes. Karen, Nora said, low, under the noise of the three-tone security alert that was still cycling somewhere in the east wing. What is happening? Karen glanced toward the retreating figures of Fitch and his entourage, then back. The Quality Review Office, Karen said, just above a whisper. They pulled the audit records tonight, both of them. A pause. Someone flagged the timestamp discrepancies. Someone in the Quality Office? Someone above the Quality Office? Karen's jaw worked. I don't know how far this goes, Nora. I genuinely don't know. But you need to understand, I didn't add your name to those records. I want you to know that. Nora studied her. Karen was not a woman who had ever been difficult to read because she had spent so long performing the institutional version of herself that the actual version was easy to see underneath it by contrast. Right now, the institutional version was gone. What was underneath it was a woman who was frightened and tired and had been carrying something she shouldn't have been carrying for longer than was good for her. Who did? Nora asked. Karen looked at the floor. 1 beat, 2. I need to speak with an attorney, she said quietly, before I say anything else. Karen, I know. She looked up. I know what I should have done. I know when I should have done it. She pulled her bag strap up on her shoulder, a small automatic gesture. I'm sorry, Nora, I mean that. She walked to the elevator. The doors opened immediately, as if the building were cooperating with her exit. She stepped in and did not look back, and the doors closed, and Nora was alone in the hallway with the three-tone alarm still cycling and the fluorescent light and the precise understanding that whatever was happening inside this institution had just passed some kind of threshold, and the next several hours were going to determine a great deal. She found Coyle exactly where she'd left him, outside Mercer's recovery room, except now he had his phone out and was reading something on it with the particular focus he gave to information he considered operationally significant. Did you do something? She asked. He looked up. Define something. The Quality Review Office pulled the audit records tonight, both of them. Fitch just walked past me like the building was on fire. Coyle tilted his head slightly. I may have made a phone call. To whom? To a federal oversight contact who has been watching Haverfield General's administrative practices for approximately 8 months in connection with a separate matter that I'm not at liberty to describe. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without ornament, leaving her to do the math. That contact may have accelerated a timeline. She stared at him. You told me you were going to identify who sent the photo. I did that too, and while I was doing that, I realized the person who sent the photo had been attempting to contact the federal oversight contact for 3 weeks without getting through the right channels. He put his phone in his pocket. so I facilitated a connection. Damien. Nora. I told you specifically. You told me not to use my unit's leverage to solve a hospital HR problem, he said, and she could hear the precise care with which he had filed away her exact words and was now returning them. This isn't an HR problem anymore. 2 falsified government-adjacent medical records involving a healthcare worker with prior federal service is potentially a federal matter. That's a different category. She wanted to argue with him. She understood the argument she would be making, that she had not asked for this, that she had a plan, that allowing outside intervention changed the shape of what she was building in ways she couldn't fully predict. All of those things were true. She also understood, with the part of her that had been trained to read situations rather than just feel them, that Coyle was right. Who sent the photo? She asked instead. Radiology tech, he said. Thomas Ward. He's been at Haverfield for 9 years. He found the first record by accident 3 months ago while pulling imaging files for a quality review. He didn't know what it meant immediately. When he figured it out, he tried to report it internally and was told the matter had been reviewed and closed. So he kept a copy. He kept 3 copies. Different locations. Coyle almost smiled. He's not stupid. Does he know his name is going to come out of this? He knows. He decided he was okay with it. A pause. He said he was tired of walking past you in the hallway knowing what he knew. She absorbed that. Someone she almost certainly recognized, someone she had passed in the hallways of this hospital for 9 years without knowing the weight he was carrying, who had made a decision that cost him something and done it anyway. I need to call him, she said. Tomorrow. Tonight you need to let the process run. What process? The federal contact has authority to conduct a records review without hospital administrative approval. They're doing that now. That's what Fitch is running to deal with. He looked at her steadily. You don't need to be in that building for the next few hours. You need to be somewhere that isn't this hallway. She thought about this. She looked at the door of Mercer's recovery room, and then at the hallway behind her, and then at Coyle. I'm coming back in the morning, she said. I know. And if this federal contact decides to make this bigger than it needs to be, then we'll deal with that, he said. One thing at a time. She drove home in the particular exhaustion of someone who had used up every available resource and was running on the metabolic equivalent of fumes. She ate something, toast, half a container of leftover soup she didn't remember making, and she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, and she added to the documentation she had been building since 5:45 that morning, because even with the federal contact and the records review and Fitch running for the administrative elevator, she was not going to let anyone else hold the primary record of what had happened. That was hers. It would stay hers. She went to bed at 10 past midnight. She was awake by 4:11, which was 40 minutes before her alarm, because some part of her nervous system had done the math on how much was unsettled and decided that 4:11 was a reasonable time to stop pretending to sleep. She lay in the dark for a moment and listened to the city making its early morning sounds. A truck on the boulevard 3 blocks over, a dog somewhere close by, the irregular percussion of wind against the bedroom window. She thought about Thomas Ward, who had spent 3 months walking past her in hospital hallways with a copy of a falsified document. She thought about Karen Platt on the elevator, her jaw working, the sorry she had delivered with the specific weight of something she'd been holding for long enough that it had left a mark. She thought about Dav Mercer telling her not to let them, which was the kind of statement that was easy to make from a recovery bed with a surgical dressing on your arm and considerably harder to enact from the middle of a situation that kept developing new dimensions. She got up. She made coffee. She went back to the documentation. She arrived at Haverfield General at 7:53, which was 7 minutes before the start of what was nominally her infusion center shift, and she knew something was different before she got through the main entrance because there were 2 vehicles in the visitor parking lot that had not been there the previous day. A dark blue sedan with government plates and a white SUV with a Haverfield County Health Administration sticker that was 3 years out of date, which usually meant it belonged to someone from the State Health Oversight Office who had been driving the same vehicle since the previous administration. She did not stop to look at them. She kept walking. In the lobby, the security desk was staffed by someone she didn't recognize, not Eddie Cartwright with his highlight reels, but a younger woman with the careful posture of someone operating outside her usual routine. The woman checked Nora's badge without making eye contact, which was different from normal, and Nora clipped her badge back on and went to the elevator. She did not go to the infusion center. She went to the fourth floor, where the quality review office shared a suite with the compliance and risk management departments, and where, she had correctly predicted, there were now two people she had never seen before sitting in the small waiting area outside the suite's frosted glass door, both of them with the particular containment of people who were present in an official capacity. One of them looked up when she came off the elevator. "Nora Voss?" he said. "Yes." "Ryan Pollard." He stood, federal. She could read it in the badge that he showed her. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. "We'd like to speak with you this morning, if you have time. I have a shift starting at 8. We've spoken with the nursing director. Your schedule is adjusted for this morning." She looked at him. He was 40, maybe 42, with the efficient face of someone who worked in institutional accountability and had stopped being surprised by what he found. His partner, a woman who remained seated and was reviewing something on a tablet, didn't look up. "All right," Nora said. "Then let's talk." The conversation lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, which she knew precisely because she checked the time when it started and when it ended, a habit. Pollard was methodical. He had the records, both of them, the ones with her name attached to adverse events she had not been present for. And he had the timestamp metadata, and she gathered from the way he phrased certain questions, at least partial access to the Sutter Ridge records from Marsh's previous position. He asked her questions about the quality complaint she had filed, about the scheduling reassignment, about the meeting with Marsh and Fitch, about the photograph she had received. He asked her about her nursing history at Haverfield, about specific cases, about the documented interactions she had recorded in her work journal. She gave him the journal. She had made a copy, which she kept. His partner, whose name was Agent Dalton, asked questions about the SEAL team's arrival, specifically about the sequence of clinical events and whether there had been any administrative interference with treatment. There hadn't. She said so. At the end of the 2 hours and 14 minutes, Pollard sat back slightly and said, "Ms. Voss, I want to be clear about where we are. This investigation is not primarily about you. You are a witness and he chose the word carefully, a documentation source. You're not a subject." "I know," she said. "What I'd ask is that you continue your regular work schedule and avoid discussing the specifics of this conversation with other hospital staff." "Understood. We may need to speak with you again, possibly as early as this afternoon." "I'll be in the infusion center," she said, "or wherever they put me." Pollard looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, and she could tell he didn't say this kind of thing often. "The work journal is going to matter. The documentation matters." "I know that too," she said. She went to the infusion center. She worked. She administered medications and monitored vitals and adjusted flow rates, and had a brief professional conversation with Patricia Sung about a patient whose access site was showing early signs of infiltration, and Patricia Sung responded to her with something that was approximately 12% warmer than the previous day, which suggested that word was traveling through the hospital's informal channels in ways that the official channels had not yet confirmed. At 11:30, Mr. Delacroix came in for an additional supportive infusion. He looked better than the day before, marginally, the way people looked when they had slept and the nausea had receded to a level they could function around. He saw her immediately. "Still here," he said, settling into his bay chair with the careful movements of a man managing several discomforts simultaneously. "Still here," she confirmed, beginning the access check. "Things must be improving." "Things are in process." He made a sound that suggested he found that acceptable. She worked quietly for a moment, checking the site, preparing the line. "My daughter's a nurse," he said. "Did I tell you that?" "You didn't." "Pediatric oncology? Up in Seattle. She's been a nurse for 11 years. He adjusted his position. "She tells me about the way hospitals treat the people who actually do the work. I never really understood it until I spent enough time in hospitals being a patient." He looked at her. "You do the work that matters, and someone else takes the credit for the outcome and the blame for the problem." She was quiet for a moment, running the line check. "That's one version of it," she said. "Is there a different version?" She looked up at him. "Sometimes the people doing the work aren't as clean as the story makes them." He raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised. "Including you?" She thought about a Tuesday afternoon overseas, sitting outside a trauma tent with her hands still shaking. She thought about the teammate she couldn't bring back. She thought about all the ways a person could fail someone they were trying to save, and how none of those ways were simple, and none of them went away. "Including me," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded, once, as if she had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. "Good," he said. "I don't trust people who don't think that." The escalation happened at 2:17 in the afternoon. She heard it from the infusion center, not clearly, but enough. Raised voices from the direction of the administrative corridor on the floor above, which was unusual enough to make Patricia Sung pause what she was doing and look at the ceiling. The security alert tone sounded again, a single cycle this time rather than repeating. Then footsteps on the stairwell, multiple sets moving down. Her phone buzzed. Coil. Marsh is being walked out. Fitch tried to intervene, didn't work. There are 4 OIG people in the records room right now. She read it twice. Then she put her phone back in her pocket and kept working, because her patients were here, and they were not part of this, and the line she was monitoring needed monitoring. At 2:49, Pollard appeared at the infusion center entrance. Patricia Sung looked at his badge and then at Nora with an expression she was doing her best to keep neutral. "Ms. Voss," Pollard said, "when you have a moment." She finished what she was doing. She told the patient in Bay 3 she'd be back in 5 minutes. She stepped into the hallway. "Marsh has been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation," Pollard said without preamble. "The board is convening an emergency session this evening. We've asked them to delay any personnel decisions until we complete the records review, and they've agreed." "What about the records with my name?" "Both flagged as altered. The metadata confirms changes were made after the initial filing. We're in the process of identifying who made the alterations." He paused. "We believe we already know." "Is it Marsh?" He looked at her without answering, which was an answer. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now. Possibly a formal statement tomorrow." He studied her. "Are you all right?" She considered the question. Her feet hurt. She had been awake since 4:11. She had spent 2 hours answering federal questions and 4 hours running infusion drips, and somewhere in there had eaten half a granola bar from her bag pocket. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not the same thing." "I know. It's what I've got right now." He nodded. "Go finish your shift. We'll be in touch." She finished her shift. At 4:50, as she was completing her end-of-day documentation, Priya Anand appeared in the infusion center with the look of a woman who had been trying to find the right moment to have a conversation for several hours. "Walk with me," Priya said. They walked to the small garden terrace on the east side of the building, which was used primarily by patients in recovery and was, at this hour, empty. Priya sat on a concrete bench and looked at the middle distance in the way she did when she was organizing her thoughts. "I've been asked to provide a statement," Priya said, "by the OIG team about the Mercer case and your clinical assessment." "What did you tell them?" "What I told you the night it happened, that your identification of the tamponade was correct, was timely, and that absent your intervention he would not have survived to reach the OR." She paused. "I also told them about the conversation I observed between you and Dr. Marsh approximately 2 weeks ago when you raised the concerns about the imaging protocol." Nora looked at her. "I should have said something at the time," Priya said. "The admission was flat, factual. I heard the exchange. I was in the hallway. His response to you was inappropriate, and I didn't say so." She looked down at her hands. "I told myself it wasn't my area, that it was a nursing administration matter." She stopped. "That was wrong." "Yes," Nora said, simply. "I'm sorry." "I know." She meant it. It was not a large sorry or a sufficient sorry, but she had learned that insufficiency was the natural size of most apologies, and that what mattered more was the decision made afterward. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to give the statement, fully. I'm going to tell them exactly what I saw, and when I saw it, and what I chose not to do about it." Priya looked up at her. "And I'm going to put it in writing to the board that your clinical judgment on the night the Mercer case arrived was the most accurate diagnostic read I have seen performed under those conditions in 12 years of trauma surgery, and that the hospital should have this woman in an emergency department, not an infusion center." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I'm doing what I should have done weeks ago." Priya stood. "That's a different thing." She was walking back through the main corridor toward the staff exit when her phone rang. Not a text, a call. The number was the federal contact line Pollard had given her. She answered. Ms. Voss? Not Pollard's voice, someone older, more authoritative. I'm Deputy Inspector Carla Hennis, OIG Regional Oversight. I want to update you on where we are. She stopped walking, found a quiet alcove near the pharmacy window. Go ahead. We have completed the initial records review. What we found extends beyond the 2 records involving your name. We have identified a pattern of documentation alterations across 11 cases spanning the past 14 months. In 4 of those cases, the altered records shifted responsibility for adverse events away from the primary attending physician. Nora's chest did a thing she had felt before, not quite surprised because she had already suspected the shape of it, but the specific heaviness of a suspicion confirmed at a larger scale than she'd anticipated. The primary attending being Marsh, she said. In most cases, yes. In 3 cases, a second attending is also implicated. A pause. We're not in a position to share names at this stage. Understood. I want to be clear about something. The records review was initiated this week, but the underlying audit that made it possible, the quality complaint you filed 14 months into a pattern that nobody else had formally flagged, that is what created the thread. Your complaint is why we had grounds to pull the records we pulled. She did not say anything for a moment. Ms. Voss? I'm here, she said. I'm listening. I want you to know that the work you did, filing that complaint, maintaining documentation, not allowing yourself to be removed from the process, that work has material consequences for 11 patients whose records were altered and potentially for others we haven't identified yet. Hennis paused. I also want you to know that the board has been informed that any personnel action against you will be reviewed by this office and may constitute obstruction of a federal investigation. I expect that communication has already had an effect on certain decisions. Nora leaned against the wall of the alcove. The pharmacy window had its shutter down for shift change. The corridor was quiet in that mid-afternoon way, between the lunch rush and the pre-dinner patient movement. What happens next? She asked. We continue the investigation. There will be formal interviews. There may be hearings depending on what the full audit reveals. The board is convening tonight, and we've requested that they take no irreversible personnel actions until the investigation concludes. A pause. You should retain legal counsel if you haven't already. I've already made that call. Good. Another pause, briefer. You may also want to know. The nurse who was displaced in the Sutter Ridge pattern we mentioned. She filed a complaint that was closed. She's been contacted. She's agreed to speak with us. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. All right, she said. We'll be in touch. And Ms. Voss? Hennis stopped, and when she continued, her voice had shifted by 1 small register, just enough to signal that this was not the official part of the conversation anymore. Get some rest. You're going to need it for what comes next. The call ended. She stood in the alcove for a moment, and then she kept walking toward the staff exit, and she pushed through it into the late afternoon, and the air was cold and smelled like early fall, and the sky had gone to that particular color that happened between 4 and 5 when the light started to consider leaving. She stood in the ambulance bay. She put her phone in her bag. She thought about what Hennis had said. 11 cases, not 2. 11. She thought about Thomas Ward, 9 years at this hospital, 3 months of walking past her in the hallway. She thought about the first patient, the 63-year-old with chest pain 14 months ago, the night she remembered but could not prove she'd been there, except that her scheduling records could prove it, and apparently now a federal investigation could prove it, and somewhere in this institution the record that had been altered to carry her name was now flagged and was waiting for the process to finish turning over the stones beneath which everything had been hidden. She was still standing there when her phone buzzed one more time. She looked at it. Thomas Ward. His actual name in her contacts now, because Coyle had sent it to her 2 hours ago with the number. The text said, "They called me in. I'm going to tell them everything. I wanted you to know before I went in." She typed back, "Thank you. I mean that." His response took 30 seconds. "There's something else. I found a third record. Different patient, different date, but the same edit signature, same user credential, same timestamp pattern. This one's from before Marsh arrived." She stared at that. Before Marsh arrived. She read it again. Then she looked up at the hospital building, at the lit windows of the administrative floor, at the emergency department entrance where, 2 nights ago, a Black Hawk had changed everything, and she thought about the shape of what she thought she had been looking at, and how it had just become something different and larger and older than she'd understood. Her phone buzzed again. Not Tomas this time. Unknown number, different from the previous unknowns. She answered it on the second ring. Silence for a moment. Then a voice she did not recognize, male, low, with the particular controlled quality of someone speaking in a space they were not certain was private. "Ms. Voss," the voice said, "you don't know me, but I've been watching what's happening at Haverfield, and there are things in that hospital that go back further than Marsh, things the OIG doesn't have visibility into yet." A pause. "You need to know that someone else in that building has been managing records for a very long time. And that person knows the OIG is there tonight, and that person is not going to wait for the investigation to reach them." The line went dead. She lowered the phone. The ambulance bay was empty. The late afternoon sky was exactly the color it had been 2 minutes ago. Somewhere above her, in the administrative floor of Haverfield General Hospital, people were making decisions. Documents were being reviewed. A 14-month pattern was being unraveled. And somewhere in this building, according to a voice she did not know, someone who had been here longer than Marsh and had been hiding something bigger was deciding what to do before the investigation found them. Her mind went to the third record Tomas had found, the one from before Marsh arrived. And then she turned and walked back into the hospital, because whatever was happening inside this building in the next hour, she was not going to be standing in a parking lot when it did. She went in through the main entrance because the side doors required a secondary badge swipe after 5, and she did not want to add her access record to anything that might complicate the next hour, and she walked through the lobby with the specific quality of someone who belonged there, which she did, which mattered. The lobby was not normal. There were 2 people she did not recognize near the information desk, not staff, not visitors, the particular stillness of people positioned rather than waiting. One of them glanced at her badge as she passed and did not say anything. She did not slow down. She took the stairs to the administrative floor. The hallway was occupied. 3 OIG staff she recognized from the morning, plus Pollard himself, standing near the records room with his phone out and a conversation happening on it that he was clearly trying to finish quickly. Agent Dalton was at the door of the compliance suite talking to a woman Nora didn't recognize who had the Haverfield General Board member lanyard and the expression of someone whose evening had become unrecognizable from what they'd planned. Pollard saw her come off the stairwell and held up one finger, 1 minute, then finished his call. "Ms. Voss." He moved toward her, lowering his voice. "You should not be on this floor right now." "I got a call," she said. 11 minutes ago. Unknown number. Male voice. He told me there's someone in this hospital who's been managing records longer than Marsh, and that they know you're here and they're not going to wait." Pollard went still. "He said it goes back further than Marsh," she said, "that you don't have visibility into it yet." "Did you record the call?" "No, it was 12 seconds and he was gone." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating. "Could you identify the voice?" "No, controlled, deliberate. Someone being careful about being heard." She paused. "The radiology tech, Tomas Ward, he found a third record. Different patient, different date. Edit signature consistent with the others, but from before Marsh arrived. I got that text at 4:42. Pollard's expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. Something tightened around the eyes. "Come with me," he said. The room they went into was a conference room she had been in once before, during a hospital accreditation walkthrough 3 years ago. It had a long table and a wall-mounted display and windows that looked onto the interior atrium. 3 laptops were open on the table. Agent Dalton came in behind them and closed the door. "Walk me through Tomas Ward's text," Pollard said. He was not sitting, neither was Dalton. Nora told him. The third record, the edit signature, the date that preceded Marsh's arrival. "How far before Marsh?" Dalton asked. Tomas didn't specify. He said before. "That's all I have." Pollard and Dalton exchanged a look that had the compressed communication of people who worked together long enough to say things without words. Dalton moved to one of the laptops. "We've been in the record system for 6 hours, Pollard said, to Nora now, explaining something he didn't usually explain, which told her he had decided she was useful to keep informed. "We identified 11 altered records. All of them within the past 14 months. All consistent with the same access credential. He paused. The access credential belongs to Elliot Marsh. But if there's a third record that predates Marsh, then either someone else has been using a consistent method long enough that Marsh learned it from them, or there's a second access credential we haven't found yet. He looked at the window. Or Marsh had system access before he officially arrived on staff. She sat with that for a moment. That's 3 different explanations. Yes. Do you know which one it is? Not yet, Dalton said from the laptop. I've got the ward record pulled. Third file dated 22 months ago. Adverse event. Patient deterioration in postoperative monitoring. 61-year-old male. Cardiac complication. She looked up. The original attending of record listed is Reginald Holt. The name settled in the room. Nora knew the name. She had never worked closely with Holt. He was cardiothoracic surgery. She was ER. But she knew him the way you knew people at a mid-sized hospital where the departments overlapped in shared spaces. He had been at Haverfield for 19 years. He was the kind of institutional fixture who appeared at every all-staff meeting and every board dinner photograph and was on 3 hospital committees and whose name appeared on the lobby donor wall in the medium-tier acknowledgement range. The alteration on this record, Dalton said, changed the monitoring nurse of record, moved responsibility for the monitoring gap from the surgical team to nursing staff. A pause. The credential used to make the alteration belongs to Elliot Marsh. But Marsh wasn't here 22 months ago, Nora said. No, Pollard said. He wasn't. The thing about institutional patterns was that they required institutional knowledge to build. Marsh had come from Sutter Ridge and had spent 14 months at Haverfield, and in that time had managed to alter 11 records and construct a system by which adverse events were redirected before they could accumulate against his name. That was not a small thing to accomplish in 14 months. It required knowing the system. It required, specifically, knowing which access credentials had weak monitoring, which record fields were least likely to be audited, and which staff members were unlikely to raise challenges. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Pollard made a call. He was on it for 3 minutes, standing at the window with his back to the room, speaking in the low register of someone delivering information up a chain rather than receiving it. When he finished, he turned around. "We need to speak with Reginald Holt," he said. "Is he in the building?" Dalton asked. "He was as of 2 hours ago. Cardiothoracic has an evening procedure scheduled." He looked at Nora. "You know this hospital. Where would he be between a procedure and evening rounds?" She thought about it. "Surgical consult lounge on 6 if he's decompressing. His office on the same floor if he's doing paperwork. Cafeteria is possible, but less likely. He usually orders up." "6th floor," Pollard said. To Dalton, "Go, take Reyes with you." Then to Nora, "I need you to stay here." "I know this building." "I know you do. Stay here." His voice was not unkind, but it was definitive. "You're a witness. If you're present when we approach Holt, anything he says becomes complicated. You understand that." She did. She did not like it, but she understood it. She sat in the conference room with one of the junior OIG staff, who had the particular assignment of making sure she stayed in the conference room, and she drank a cup of coffee from the cart in the corner that had been sitting there long enough to be approximately the temperature of mild disappointment, and she waited. She had been waiting for 23 minutes when Karen Platt opened the conference room door. The junior OIG staff member stood up, but Karen wasn't moving with the energy of someone who needed to be stopped. She was moving with the energy of someone who had made a decision and was executing it before she changed her mind. "I need to speak with Ms. Voss," Karen said. "Ma'am, this room is—" "I've already spoken with Agent Pollard. He said 5 minutes." She held up her phone, showing a text thread that the OIG staff member apparently verified because he sat back down. Karen came in and sat across the table from Nora. She looked worse than she had the previous evening. The kind of worse that came from not sleeping and knowing why you weren't sleeping and not being able to change either of those things. "I'm going to give them a statement tonight," she said. "Full statement. I wanted to tell you directly before I did." "All right," Nora said. "I need you to know what I knew and when." Karen folded her hands on the table. They were not steady. "I found out about the first record 2 months after Marsh arrived. I wasn't looking for it. I was pulling a file for a different reason, and I saw your name on a case I knew you hadn't been part of. I knew your schedule. I knew you weren't there." "What did you do?" I asked Marsh about it. He said it was a clerical error, that it would be corrected. She stopped. It wasn't corrected. And you didn't escalate. No. The word was flat and final, and Karen didn't try to put anything around it. He told me the error had already been flagged and was being reviewed. He told me that if I raised it independently, it would create confusion in an active review. He was very specific about the phrasing. A pause. I believed him. And then I stopped believing him, and I still didn't say anything because by then I was part of the silence. Nora looked at her. She thought about the 4 years they had worked together, the reasonable, careful relationship they had maintained, the times Karen had managed situations well, and the times she had managed them safely, which were not always the same thing. Did you know about the others? Nora asked. The other 10 records? No, I knew about yours, only yours. She met Nora's eyes. That's the truth. Is there anything else I should know before you give the statement? Karen was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something in it. Holt came to Marsh, she said, not the other way around. When Marsh first arrived, the first week, Holt came to him privately. I saw them together twice in circumstances that didn't fit any normal professional reason. I didn't think about it at the time. She paused. I think Holt had a problem from before Marsh arrived, and I think he brought Marsh in to help manage it. Brought him in as in recruited him. I don't know. I don't have evidence of that. I'm telling you what I observed and what I've thought about over the past 48 hours. She looked at the table. Marsh didn't randomly come to Haverfield. The board search for an ER director had been ongoing for 7 months. Holt is on the medical executive committee. He has influence over physician recruitment. Nora absorbed this. Give them everything, she said. All of it, including the parts where you're not certain. Karen nodded. She stood. At the door, she stopped. I should have done this months ago, she said. Yes, Nora said. But you're doing it now. Karen left. Pollard came back at 6:41 with the specific compression around his expression that she had started to associate with things going in a direction that was significant. He sat down across from her. Holt was not in the building, he said. He was scheduled for an evening procedure. The procedure was reassigned at 4:15 this afternoon. His office said he left for a personal appointment. He put his phone on the table. We have reason to believe he was informed about the investigation. We're working on confirming his location. She stared at him. He ran. He left the building, Pollard said carefully. We don't yet know the circumstances. The call I received at 4:40, unknown number, male voice, someone inside this building. We're looking at that. If Holt knew you were here, and if someone called me to tell me there was a person in this building who was going to move before the investigation reached them, she worked it through out loud because sometimes the working through itself was useful. Then either the person who called me was warning me, or they were trying to direct my attention somewhere specific. Both are possible, Pollard said. If it was a warning, then someone wanted us moving faster than we were. And if it was misdirection? He held her gaze. Then we're looking at Holt while something else is happening. He picked up his phone. Which is why we're not only looking at Holt. At 7:15, this board convened in the second-floor boardroom as scheduled. Nora knew this because the hospital's internal communications system, to which she still had access, pushed a meeting notification at 7:12. She knew the board meeting's agenda had been restructured because Pollard had told her, and she knew that 3 board members had been briefed by the OIG team before the meeting because she had been in the conference room while 2 of those briefings happened by phone. What she did not know, until 7:43, was that one of the board members had arrived at the hospital that evening with a personal attorney. That board member was Lionel Varga, who served as chair of the Medical Executive Committee and who had, according to the hospital's published board roster, been in his role for 11 years. Varga was 71 years old and had the particular authority of someone who had survived enough institutional cycles to understand how they worked and how to stay on the right side of them. Nora had seen him at 2 all-staff events and at a patient advocacy panel she had attended 2 years ago. He had the manner of a man who listened carefully and said things that sounded responsive without quite committing to anything. The personal attorney was not Fitch. This information arrived via Dalton, who came back to the conference room at 7:43 with the efficient expression of someone adding a data point to a picture that was becoming clearer. Varga retained independent counsel this afternoon, she said to Pollard. The attorney has already sent a preservation notice to the hospital's records system. Which means Varga is protecting himself, Pollard said. Which means Varga knows there's something to protect himself from. Nora thought about Holt on the medical executive committee. She thought about 11 years in a chair position and the kind of access that came with being on the committee that oversaw physician recruitment. Holt and Varga, she said. Both of them looked at her. If Holt had a problem from before Marsh arrived, she said, and if Holt used his position on the executive committee to bring Marsh in, someone had to approve that process. Someone senior. She looked at Pollard. Who oversees the medical executive committee? He said, the board chair. And before Varga? Dalton was already at the laptop. What the laptop produced over the next 40 minutes was not simple. The access logs for the hospital's records system, the ones the OIG team had been reviewing since their arrival, contained, buried in 14 months of Marsh's activity, 4 access events that did not match Marsh's credential pattern. They were older. The timestamps were 22 months ago, consistent with the third record Tomas Ward had found. The access method was different, a legacy credential format that the hospital's current system still supported for backward compatibility, but that was not assigned to any active staff member. It was assigned to a former staff member, a records administrator who had retired 4 years ago, whose system access had never been formally revoked. Dalton said it plainly. Someone has been using a retired employee's access credential for at least 22 months. The credential is still active because the offboarding process didn't close it. Who knew the credential existed? Pollard asked. Anyone with administrative access to the user management system. Dalton looked up. That list includes the records department, IT administration, and she stopped. The medical executive committee chair. The committee has oversight of administrative operations. Pollard looked at Nora. She looked back at him. Varga knew the credential existed, she said, and knew it was still active. The board meeting ended at 9:12. She knew this because Pollard came back to the conference room at 9:18 with the exhausted, precise expression of someone who had been doing this kind of work for long enough to recognize a specific shape of institutional reckoning. He sat down. For the first time since she'd met him, he poured himself a cup of the terrible lukewarm coffee. Holt has been located, he said. He was at his home. He had not fled. He had retained an attorney and was waiting to be contacted. A pause. His attorney has indicated he is prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for consideration, which meant Holt was going to tell them everything. The board has voted to suspend Marsh's privileges indefinitely, pending investigation. Fitch has been released as hospital counsel, conflict of interest. The board is in discussion about interim leadership. He drank the coffee without reacting to it, which impressed her. The records matter is still developing. The credential issue is going to take time to unravel completely. Varga, she said. Varga's attorney is communicating with our office. He said it in the measured way of someone who was not yet ready to say more than that. Is he a subject? He is a person of significant interest. She processed this. 11 years of board chair. A credential that was never revoked. A pattern that started 22 months ago, 5 months before Marsh arrived, which meant someone had needed a mechanism before they needed Marsh, and Marsh had been brought in to expand it, or improve it, or both. What about my records, she said, the ones with my name? Both are being formally corrected tonight. The corrections will include documentation of the alteration and the investigation. Your personnel file will reflect no adverse findings. He looked at her. Your quality complaint is being reinstated as an active investigation matter. She sat with that for a moment. The complaint that had started all of this, the imaging protocol, the 2 missed diagnoses, the memo she had sent, and the meeting where she had been told about team alignment and constructive channels, was now, 14 months after she had filed it, and 2 weeks after she had refiled it, being treated as the legitimate clinical concern it had always been. The infusion center reassignment, she said, grounds for that decision are being reviewed as a potential retaliatory action. He put the cup down. I would expect you to be contacted by hospital leadership about your return to the ER within the next 24 hours. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands, which were, for the first time in several days, not in the process of doing anything, just existing on the table surface. There's going to be a lot of process after this, she said. A significant amount, yes. Formal statement. Hearings, possibly. Possibly, Yes, she nodded slowly. I'll be available. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite admiration. He was too contained for that, but was in the vicinity of it. Ms. Voss, he said, for what it's worth, in 14 years of records investigation work, the number of times a case was as well documented by its primary witness as this one was. He stopped, recalibrated. The journal, the timestamps, the chain of communications you maintained. That's not nothing. I know, she said. I've been doing paperwork since before most of the people in this building finished their training. I know what it's worth. She left the hospital at 9:44. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of fall night that announced the season's arrival without apology. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment, the same ambulance bay where, 2 nights ago, she had stood with her phone in her hand and thought about Portland and her sister's spare room and the particular appeal of being somewhere that required nothing of her. She took out her phone. Not to call Bridget. Not yet. She looked at the text from Tomas Ward that she had sent her response to hours ago. Then she found his number and called it. He picked up on the 3rd ring. He sounded tired but awake, the way people sounded when something large had happened and they hadn't quite found the shape of the after yet. It's Voss, she said. I know, he said. I've been waiting to hear how it went. It went. She thought about how to compress the past 5 hours into something communicable. They have the records. They have the credential trail. Marsh is suspended. Holt is cooperating. The board is in crisis management mode. A long pause. And Varga? She was quiet for a moment. In process. That means they know. Oh, that means they're building what they need to act on what they know. She paused. Tomas, what you did, finding the first record, keeping the copies, sending it when you did, that started this. I want you to know I understand that. I almost didn't, he said. 3 times I almost deleted everything. It felt... He stopped. It felt too big. I'm a radiology tech. This isn't what I do. And yet, a quiet exhale. And yet, then what, are you going to be okay with all the process ahead? She thought about formal statements and possible hearings and the particular grinding quality of institutional investigations that could take months and required a specific kind of endurance. I've operated in worse conditions, she said. It came out slightly dry, and he made a sound that was almost a laugh. I'll bet, he said. Get some sleep, she said. You're going to need to give a statement soon, maybe tomorrow. Be straightforward. You don't need to be anything other than what you are. What am I? Someone who kept the record, she said. That's enough. She hung up. She started walking toward the parking structure. She was halfway through the ambulance bay when her phone buzzed again, and she checked it because she had been checking it consistently for 2 days, and the habit was well established now. It was not a number she had seen before. The message was brief. Varga is going to approach you directly, tonight or tomorrow. He is going to try to make you an offer. Whatever it is, do not agree to anything without counsel present. He still has leverage you don't know about. She stopped walking. She looked at the message. She looked at the parking structure, at the lit exit signs, at the handful of cars left in the staff lot this late. The number had a Portland area code. She stared at that for a long moment, running through the people who knew she had a connection to Portland, who would have a Portland number, who would know enough about what was happening inside Haverfield General to warn her about a specific board member's likely move. Then her mind went to something Coyle had said. I knew where you were. I pulled your records 6 months ago. Coyle had contacts. Coyle had made calls. Coyle had connected Thomas Ward to the federal oversight contact. Coyle was leaving tomorrow morning with Mercer's transfer. But Coyle knew people. And people who worked in federal oversight sometimes had colleagues in regions outside their primary jurisdiction, and sometimes those colleagues monitored things at the request of other offices. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, those colleagues were in Portland. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was someone else entirely. Maybe it was one of the 3 people on the Sutter Ridge nursing staff who had tried to file a complaint 18 months ago and had been waiting for something to attach it to. The point, she understood, was that someone had just told her Varga was going to approach her, which meant the process that Pollard had described as developing was not as settled as it appeared. She looked at the hospital entrance, the lit lobby, the security desk where the unfamiliar woman had checked her badge without making eye contact. She thought about an offer. What kind of offer did a 71-year-old board chair with personal counsel and 11 years of institutional authority make to a nurse with a work journal and a federal investigation at her back? And what kind of leverage, she thought, did a man like Varga hold that she didn't know about? She stood in the cold night air of the ambulance bay and thought about the fact that she had spent 2 days believing she was looking at a 14-month pattern that had started with Marsh, and then a 22-month pattern that had started before him. And now someone was telling her that there was still something she didn't know. She put her phone in her pocket. She turned around. She walked back through the hospital entrance, back past the unfamiliar security guard, back to the elevator, because she had left her work journal in the conference room on the administrative floor, and she was not going home without it. And because whatever was coming next, whatever offer Varga intended to make, whatever leverage she didn't yet know about, she was going to face it the same way she had faced the tamponade in the trauma bay 3 nights ago. Already in the room, already working. The elevator opened on the administrative floor and she stepped out, and the hallway was quieter now, the OIG staff reduced from the afternoon rush to a smaller overnight presence, and she moved toward the conference room, and she was reaching for the door handle when she heard her name. Not Voss. Her first name. Nora. She turned. Lionel Varga was standing at the end of the hallway near the boardroom door, in his suit jacket with his tie loosened, with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something to arrive and had just seen it come off the elevator. No attorney beside him, no staff, just him. He looked older than she had ever seen him look at a board event or a panel discussion. Not physically older, the same height, the same precise posture, but aged in some interior way that showed around the eyes and in the particular set of his shoulders. He held her gaze across the length of the hallway. "I think we should talk," he said. She looked at him for a moment without moving. The hallway between them was maybe 30 feet. The overhead lights were on their night setting, slightly dimmer than daytime, and Varga stood in that softer light looking like what he was. A man who had spent 11 years building something he believed was permanent and had spent the past several hours watching it develop cracks. He couldn't stop. "I don't think we should," she said. He took one step toward her, not aggressive, more the automatic response of someone used to people coming to meet them halfway. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. My counsel has advised me not to have private conversations with anyone connected to the investigation. She had retained the attorney that morning. The advice was accurate. "I'm not asking as a board member," he said. "I'm asking as someone who has information you should have before the formal process completes. Then give it to Agent Pollard. Pollard is looking at what Marsh did and what Holt did." He stopped. The step had brought him to the middle of the hallway, close enough that she could see the specific kind of tired he was carrying. Not the tired of overwork, but the tired of sustained maintenance, of holding something in place for a very long time. "What I know goes further back than either of them." She held his gaze. She did not move toward him, and she did not move away from him, because both of those movements communicated something, and she was not yet ready to communicate anything. "How much further back?" she asked. 9 years, he said. The number sat in the air between them. 9 years ago, Nora Voss had been in her 3rd deployment overseas. She had not been at Haverfield General. She had not known this building existed. Whatever had started 9 years ago had started without her, and she had walked into the middle of it simply by showing up, filing a complaint, and refusing to leave. "Then you really should talk to Pollard," she said. "Tonight." Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly. More like the particular expression of a man who had been hoping for a different outcome and had just accepted that this was the one he was going to get. "There are things that will come out in the investigation," he said, "that will be worse for this hospital than what's already on record. Worse for the staff, for patients whose cases will be reviewed." He paused. "I can make that process shorter and cleaner if I cooperate fully, but I need certain assurances before I do." "That's a conversation for your attorney and the OIG," she said. "Not for me." "The assurances involve you." She waited. "The formal investigation will require statements from every relevant party, including you, including a full account of the Mercer case, which means your prior military service becomes part of a federal record." He said it carefully, not as a threat, but with the specificity of someone who had thought about the architecture of what he was saying. "I understand that's information you've chosen not to make public." She stood with that for a moment. It was not wrong. The Mercer case, the pericardiocentesis, the SEAL team, Coyle in the trauma bay shouting Phoenix, was going to appear in formal documentation. Priya Anand had already given a statement about the clinical events. The incident report existed. The OIG investigation, which was primarily about the record alterations, would reference the Mercer case because that was the night that had accelerated everything. Her prior service was going to be on record whether she wanted it there or not. That was not a threat. That was just what was true. "I know that," she said. He blinked. It was almost imperceptible, but she caught it because she had spent years reading people in high-pressure environments, and Lionel Varga was not as unreadable as he believed. He had expected that to land differently. "You know," he said, "it's already in Priya Anand's statement to the OIG, and Coyle's team was logged through the hospital's intake process when they brought Mercer in." She kept her voice level. "I've been aware of this since the first morning. I decided it was acceptable." He looked at her for a long moment. "I see," he said. "I appreciate that you thought you were bringing me something," she said. "I genuinely mean that. But whatever leverage you believe you have in this conversation, I've already made peace with it. So if you have information that helps the investigation, information about what started 9 years ago, give it to Pollard. Tonight. Before your attorney talks you out of it." She reached for the conference room door. "Nora." His voice had changed. The architecture had come down. What was underneath it was simply an old man in a dim hallway who had run out of moves. "I didn't know about the record alterations. I want you to know that. Whatever Holt and Marsh built, I didn't know the specifics." She stopped with her hand on the door. "But you knew something," she said. A pause that was long enough to be its own answer. "Yes," he said, "I knew something." She opened the door. She picked up her work journal from the conference table where she had left it. She came back to the doorway. "Pollard's team is on this floor," she said. "They'll be here until at least midnight. Go talk to them." She walked to the elevator without looking back. She did not hear him follow her, and she did not hear him move toward the OIG team's area, and she did not know, until the following morning, which of those things he chose. He chose to talk. Pollard called her at 7:42 the next morning while she was on her second cup of coffee and had been awake since 5 because her nervous system apparently considered this a reasonable schedule now. "Varga provided a voluntary statement last night," Pollard said. 4 hours. He brought his attorney and they came to us." She set her cup down. "What did he give you?" "Context that significantly changes the shape of what we're looking at." He paused. The pause of someone who was about to share more than they usually shared and had decided it was warranted. 9 years ago, there was a surgical complication in Haverfield's cardiothoracic department. A patient died. The attending was Reginald Holt. The complication was manageable. It was the response to the complication that was inadequate. Holt made a decision that extended the patient's deterioration by several critical minutes. "That's a reportable event," she said. "It should have been. It wasn't. The case was reviewed internally. Varga was board chair. The review found no fault." "Because Varga managed the review." "Varga influenced the composition of the review committee. Yes, he's admitting that." A pause. "The patient was a city councilman. His family had significant social connections to the board. Varga made a calculation that a finding of fault would result in litigation that the hospital could not sustain at that time. The hospital was in a financial restructuring. She thought about 9 years of a secret kept at that level, the weight of it, the constant management of who knew what and how much and what records said what. So Holt had something on the hospital, she said, and the hospital had something on Holt. Mutual exposure. Varga describes it as a, Pollard seemed to be looking at something written, a shared understanding. Those were his words. And then Holt needed to expand the arrangement. 22 months ago, Holt was involved in a second adverse event. Less significant clinically, but the documentation created a trail. He needed the trail managed. He reached out to a contact at Sutter Ridge, someone who had worked with Marsh. Marsh was brought to Haverfield specifically because he had skills in records management that Holt needed. Skills, she said. Varga's word, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the nursing staff at Sutter Ridge, the 3 complaints that had been closed. She thought about the woman who had transferred departments 2 months before Marsh left, who had now agreed to speak with the OIG. What happens to Varga? She asked. That depends on what the state medical board and the DA's office decide to do with what we hand them. We're federal. Our jurisdiction is the records, the access credentials, the interstate dimensions. The underlying clinical negligence and the original cover-up is state. We're referring. A pause. At minimum, his board position is over. His attorney has already submitted his resignation, effective last night. And Holt? Holt is cooperating. His attorney has indicated he will surrender his medical license voluntarily rather than face a formal revocation proceeding. Another pause. That is not a small thing for a man who has practiced cardiothoracic surgery for 23 years. No, she said, it's not. Ms. Voss. She had come to recognize Pollard's register shifts by now, the slight change when he was moving from official to direct. Your formal status in this investigation is resolved. You are a cooperating witness and a documentation source. There are no adverse findings of any kind associated with your personnel record. The falsified records have been corrected and annotated in a way that will be part of the permanent investigation file. She held the phone and looked at her kitchen window. The morning light was doing something specific to the wall opposite, that particular October angle that made the room feel different from every other month. Thank you, she said. Thank your journal, he said, and she could hear that he almost meant it as a joke, but not quite. We'll be in touch about the formal statement, probably next week. The call from the hospital came at 9:30. Not Marsh. Marsh was on indefinite administrative leave. Not Karen Platt, who was on paid leave pending the review of her own role in the silence. The call came from the interim ER medical director, a physician named Dr. Soo-Jin Park, who had been brought from the hospital's internal medicine department as a temporary appointment and who spoke to Nora with the directness of someone who had been given a clear mandate and was not interested in managing optics. Your reassignment to the infusion center is rescinded effective immediately, Park said. The ER director position is currently vacant. Until it's filled, I'm overseeing ER operations. I'd like you back in the department starting tomorrow morning if you're available. Nora noted that she was being asked, not told. I'm available, she said. There will be a department-wide meeting this afternoon. I'm not going to pretend the past 72 hours are something that can be addressed in a meeting. But I want the staff to hear directly from me what the status of the investigation is and what the changes in leadership mean for day-to-day operations. That's a good approach, Nora said. I'm also... Park stopped briefly. I want to say, Ms. Voss, that I've reviewed your quality complaint from 2 weeks ago and the underlying concerns about the imaging protocol. The concerns are valid. I've already suspended the directive pending a full clinical review. A pause. It should not have taken what happened this week for that to occur. No, Nora said. It shouldn't have. I know that's insufficient. Yes, but it's honest, which is where things have to start. She thought for a moment. The two cases where diagnoses were delayed under the protocol, they should both be reviewed. The patients should be notified of the review, even if the outcomes were ultimately acceptable. They have a right to know. A silence that told her Park was either writing this down or had already thought of it and was confirming alignment. Agreed, Park said. I'll initiate that today. Awesome. She went to the afternoon meeting. The ER department assembled in the main conference room at 3 o'clock, attending physicians, residents, nurses, techs, a handful of people she recognized from ancillary services who worked closely with the department. Park stood at the front of the room with the particular posture of someone who was not performing authority but was exercising it, which was a different thing. Nora sat near the back. Not out of deference, just because she had always preferred a position with a view of the whole room. Park gave a clear, unembellished account of what had happened. The OIG investigation, the record alterations, the personnel changes. She used plain language, and she did not try to minimize what had occurred or redirect the room toward how the hospital was going to manage its reputation. She said that the investigation would continue and that staff would be interviewed and that the appropriate response to those interviews was to be truthful. Then she said, "The quality complaint that initiated this week's events was filed by a member of this department. That complaint should have been addressed when it was first filed. It wasn't, and the reasons for that are part of what the investigation will examine. What I want this room to understand is that the complaint was correct, the concerns were valid, and the person who filed it faced professional retaliation for doing so." The room was very quiet. "That is not acceptable," Park said, "and it will not be the standard going forward." Nora looked at the table in front of her. She looked at her hands. From across the room, Priya Anand caught her eye. Priya gave a single, small nod. The kind that did not require interpretation. From 2 seats down, she became aware that someone was looking at her, and she turned to find one of the junior residents, a young woman named Becca Trout, who had been at Haverfield for 8 months and who Nora had worked with twice in the ER, and both times had noticed for the quality of her attention. Looking at her with an expression that was not easy to read at first, and then became readable as something simple. She was paying attention to Nora specifically because she was trying to understand something about how a person did what Nora had done. Nora looked back at the front of the room. She understood that look. She had worn it herself a long time ago in a very different kind of room, watching someone navigate something that seemed impossible and trying to learn the shape of how they did it. She found Tomas Ward after the meeting in the hallway near the radiology suite, which was where he usually was at 4 in the afternoon, and which told her that whatever had happened in the past 3 days, he had come back to work and was doing his job. He saw her coming. It was thinner than she'd realized, or maybe it was the particular depletion of someone who had been carrying a weight for 3 months and had recently put it down and wasn't sure yet what to do with the absence of it. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Honestly, I don't know yet." He leaned against the wall. "I gave my formal statement this morning. 2 hours. They were thorough. They're always thorough. The attorney they had me speak with first said I'm not at risk of any adverse action. Whistleblower protections apply." He said it like someone testing the phrase to see if it fit. "I didn't think of myself as a whistleblower. I had a copy of something true, and I couldn't keep not using it." She looked at him. He was 43 or 44, she guessed. Had probably been doing this job since before some of the residents in that conference room had started college. 9 years of hospital corridors and imaging files, and the particular invisibility of technical staff in a hierarchy that always looked upward. "That's what it is," she said, "most of the time. It's not a decision. It's an inability to keep doing the other thing." He thought about that. "Is that what it was for you, filing the complaint?" "The first one, yes. The second one..." She stopped. "The second one, I knew what I was doing. I filed it because I knew what was right, and I wasn't going to let the first response stop me." She paused. "But the first one was just... I couldn't not." He nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "I know I've said it. I'm saying it again." "Don't," he said. "You'd have gotten there without me." "Maybe. It would have taken longer, and longer has costs." He looked at the floor. "Yeah," he said. "It does." She went home that evening and called Bridget. Bridget answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant some version of the story had reached her through whatever channel it traveled through between hospitals in one city and landscape architects in another. "I saw something online," Bridget said immediately, "about Haverfield General, about an investigation." "I know. Are you..." "I'm okay." She sat on her couch for the first time in what felt like several days, with her legs stretched out and her shoes still on because she hadn't quite gotten that far yet. "I'm tired, and I have a formal statement to give next week, and there's going to be a lot of process for the next few months, but I'm okay." A pause. "Did they do what you think they were doing?" "More than I thought," she said, "for longer than I knew." "And you're still there, at that hospital?" "I go back to the ER tomorrow." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "I don't understand you sometimes," she said, and it was the kind of statement that contained love inside it, even when it sounded like frustration. "You could come here. You could start somewhere new." "I know. But you're not going to." "No." "Why?" She thought about Becca Trout in the meeting room with that specific quality of attention. She thought about Mr. Delacroix, and his book, and his daughter in Seattle, who was a nurse, and his 2 rounds of cancer, and the certainty with which he had told her not to let them make her small. She thought about Tomas Ward in a hallway with a copy of something true and the inability to keep not using it. "Because the work is there," she said, "and because leaving doesn't fix anything. It just moves the problem somewhere I can't see it anymore." Bridget made a sound that was not agreement and not disagreement. "Portland is a standing offer," she said. "The Thai food situation remains." "I know." Nora almost smiled. "I'll come this weekend, after the statement." "Good," Bridget said. You look like you need to sit somewhere that isn't a hospital. She did. That was accurate. She was back in the ER by 7:15 the next morning. The department felt different in a way that was not dramatic and not obvious. You would not have seen it if you didn't know what to look for. But she had worked in this space for 6 years, and she knew its rhythms and its textures. And what was different was something in the pressure. Something that had been set wrong for longer than 2 weeks, and maybe longer than 14 months. And that had shifted. Patricia Sung from the infusion center appeared in the ER corridor at 8, which was outside her usual area, and found Nora between patients. I wanted to say, Patricia started, and then seemed to reconsider the version she'd prepared. You handled yourself well, she said instead. Last week. In the infusion center. You just worked. That's the job, Nora said. I know, but the circumstances were... She stopped again. I'm just saying, you didn't make it about you while you were there. It wasn't about me, Nora said. The patients were there. That's where the attention goes. Patricia held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the specific nod of someone adjusting an assessment they had been carrying for a while, and went back toward the elevator. Dav Mercer sent a text at 10:37. She had not expected to hear from him. He had transferred out 2 mornings ago, and she had understood that as the conclusion of their interaction, which was appropriate. People moved through emergency medicine and left behind the immediate intensity of the acute event and returned to their lives. The text said, Heard things resolved at your hospital. Good. Also heard what you did was getting written up in a federal incident report with your name on it. You know how many of us are going to read that report? She stared at it. She thought about the files that circulated in those communities, the after-action analyses, the institutional knowledge that passed informally among people who operated in spaces where the formal record was often incomplete. She typed back, Don't make me a story. His response was immediate. Too late. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the trauma bay, which had 2 patients in it, neither in immediate crisis, both receiving care from the team that was doing its job in the way this department was capable of doing its job when the conditions allowed it. She went to work. The formal investigation ran for 11 weeks. She gave 3 formal statements. The first was 2 hours and 40 minutes and covered the timeline of the quality complaint, the reassignment, and the events of the week in detail. The second was shorter, focused specifically on the clinical events of the Mercer case. The third was a written statement submitted to the state medical board reviewing Holt's license surrender. Marcia's medical license was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 4 months out. 2 of the Sutter Ridge nurses gave statements corroborating a consistent pattern of documentation management across institutions. Varga resigned from the board. The state attorney's office reviewed the 9-year-old case, the councilman who had died, the review that had been managed, the finding of no fault that had been influenced rather than reached. The statute of limitations on certain civil claims had expired, which the family's attorney contested on the grounds that the fraud had prevented discovery. That contest was ongoing. Gerald Fitch's firm withdrew from hospital representation. A new counsel was retained. Reginald Holt surrendered his license on a Thursday afternoon in November. Nora knew because Priya Anand sent her a text that said simply, It's done. She was in the middle of a trauma case when she received it and did not respond until an hour later, when she typed back, I know, which was not quite true. She had not known the specific Thursday, but was true in the way that mattered, which was that she had known it was coming and had made her peace with the timeline. The imaging protocol was formally revised in week 3 of the investigation, after a clinical review panel that included 2 external physicians, Priya Anand, and at Priya's specific recommendation, Nora. The panel found the original protocol clinically inadequate for low to moderate complexity chest pain presentations. The 2 patients whose diagnoses had been delayed were notified and offered follow-up consultations. One of them came in, met with Park, and with the attending who had managed the delay, and left saying she appreciated being told, which Nora thought was a more generous response than the situation warranted, but which she respected. The ER director position was posted in week 6. Nora was asked twice if she intended to apply. She said no both times, and she meant it both times, and was met both times with expressions of mild surprise that she found informative about how other people had started to see her. She did not want to be an ER director. She wanted to be in the trauma bay. Those were different things, and she was clear about the distinction. Karen Platt returned from leave in week 8. The investigation had found that Karen's role in the pattern was what it was. Not active participation in the alterations, but the specific species of institutional silence that allowed things to continue unchallenged. The formal finding was that her action had been insufficient in response to known information. Her nursing supervisor role was reduced to a staff position during a probationary review period. She came to find Nora in the ER on a Tuesday afternoon in her first week back. "I don't expect anything from you," Karen said. "I know what I did and what I didn't do. I'm not here to ask you to make it easier." "All right," Nora said. "I just wanted you to know that what I said in that hallway, that I'm sorry, that was real. It wasn't strategy. I wasn't calculating anything." She paused. "I was just sorry." Nora looked at her. She thought about 4 years of a professional relationship. She thought about the meeting in the office, Karen's careful voice, the phrase constructive channels. She thought about the elevator and the sorry that had cost something to say. "I know it was real," she said. "I'm not carrying it, Karen, but I can't pretend the thing didn't happen either. We're going to work together, and it'll be professional, and that's what I can offer." Karen nodded. It was not the resolution she had probably hoped for, and it was also, Nora thought, an honest one, because forgiveness was not a thing you could produce on schedule, and professional respect was not the same thing as trust, and Karen Platt was going to have to rebuild the latter one decision at a time over a period much longer than 8 weeks. "That's fair," Karen said. "Yes," Nora said. "It is." Becca Trout, the junior resident, caught up with her in the corridor near the end of week 10. "Can I ask you something?" she said, with the slight awkwardness of someone who had been trying to find the right moment for a while. "Go ahead." "When you filed the complaint the first time, before any of this happened, before the investigation, before the SEAL team, before any of it," she stopped. "Did you know it was going to work out?" Nora looked at her. "No," she said. "Then why?" "Because it was true, and it needed to be on record." She said it simply, not as a lesson, just as what it was. "That's the only calculation. Does it need to exist?" "Yes." "Then put it somewhere it exists. What happens after that is not fully in your control, and spending your energy trying to predict it is energy you don't have for the part that is in your control." Becca considered this. "That sounds exhausting." "Sometimes it is," Nora said. "It's also the only way I know to operate that doesn't require me to betray my own judgment." She paused. "Your judgment is the thing you can't afford to give away. Once you start making decisions based on whether they're safe for you instead of whether they're right, that's a hard habit to unlearn." Becca was quiet for a moment. "Did you learn it the hard way?" Nora thought about a Tuesday afternoon outside a trauma tent with her hands still shaking. She thought about the teammate she couldn't bring back. She thought about the years of covering a tattoo on her wrist and calling it privacy, when sometimes it was closer to penance. "Most things worth knowing," she said, "come from somewhere expensive." She wore short sleeves on a Wednesday in late November. Not a deliberate decision exactly. She had gotten dressed in the morning with the same routine she always used, and she had reached for the long-sleeved version of her scrub top, and then reached past it for the short-sleeved one instead, and the distinction had felt so small in the moment that she hadn't thought about it until she was already in the ER, and Patricia Sung's gaze had gone briefly to her left wrist, and then away, and Nora had looked down at the tattoo. The unit insignia faded now, the lines a little blurred with time, and had felt something that was not pride exactly, and not grief exactly, but the complex specific thing that lived in between. She had earned that mark. She had also carried it like a burden for 6 years because she'd decided that the life it represented had ended in failure on a Tuesday afternoon overseas. It hadn't ended. It had changed. Changed into 6 years of an emergency department, and a quality complaint, and a trauma bay at midnight, and a SEAL team that had diverted to Haverfield General specifically because the person they needed was there, because she had been there all along, doing the work in the only way she knew how to do it, without asking for recognition and without waiting for permission. A patient in Bay 3, a 32-year-old woman with a dislocated shoulder and the specific brittle humor of someone trying to manage pain through conversation, looked at the tattoo while Nora adjusted her IV access. "Military?" she asked. "A long time ago," Nora said. "What branch?" Navy. The woman considered this. You don't look like what people think a veteran looks like. No, Nora said. Most of us don't. The woman glanced at the tattoo again. What does it mean? Nora looked at it, the faded lines, the design she had earned at 23 years old in a different version of herself that was not, she had come to understand, a different person. It means I've been in rooms where things were bad, she said, and I didn't leave until they were better. The woman looked at her for a moment. That's a good thing to mean, she said. Yes, Nora said. I think so. Coyle sent her a message in December. Not a call, a message. Because that was the mode he used when he wanted to say something without the pressure of a real-time response. It said, Mercer is back on light duty. He told the new guys in his unit about the ER nurse who called a tamponade without a full ultrasound at midnight after a 17-hour shift. The story has developed some detail in the retelling. You apparently caught the needle one-handed. She sent back, I used both hands. He sent back, I know, but it's a better story. She looked at that for a moment. She thought about stories, the ones that circulated and grew and acquired details that hadn't happened, the ones that compressed complex things into clean moments. She had spent 6 years being afraid of the story attached to her name, Phoenix, the one who brought people home, because she knew the story was incomplete, because the story didn't include the Tuesday afternoon, the teammate she couldn't carry back. The thing she understood now, that she had been working toward understanding for 6 years, was that the incomplete story was not the dishonest story. The Tuesday afternoon was part of it. So was every patient she had kept alive afterward. So was the quality complaint and the federal investigation and Tomas Ward with his 3 copies of a document and his 9 years of hospital corridors. All of it was the story. The failure and the filing and the night she sat in ambulance bays drinking cold coffee and didn't leave. That was the thing about survival, not the dramatic version, not the one with the needle and the Blackhawks and the cinematic midnight pivot, but the actual version, which was quieter and longer and required a specific kind of stubbornness that was not glamorous and did not photograph well and was nonetheless the only thing that actually worked. You stayed in the room, you kept the record, you did not let them move you sideways out of the space where you were needed. And when the helicopter arrived, you already knew what to do because you had never actually stopped knowing. On a morning in January, she came in for her shift and found a card in her locker. It was not signed. The handwriting was even and deliberate, someone who wrote carefully. It said, I'm the daughter of the councilman who died 9 years ago. I wanted someone who worked in that hospital to know that knowing what happened, even now, matters to us. Thank you for not letting it stay buried. She stood at her locker for a long moment. She did not know how the card had gotten there. She suspected, but did not know. And she decided not to investigate because some things were better received without complete explanation. She put the card in her bag. She closed her locker. She pulled on her badge. She went into the ER, where there were already 3 patients in the bay and a 4th coming in from the ambulance entrance. And the day was beginning the way it always began, with need and urgency and the particular compressed weight of other people's worst moments arriving all at once. She was exactly where she needed to be. Not because anyone had finally recognized her, not because the investigation had cleared her name, not because a SEAL team had landed on the roof and said the name she'd spent years putting away. She was where she needed to be because she had decided, a long time ago, in a very different place, that the work was the thing, that the work was what she had, and it was enough, and it had always been enough. And no amount of institutional machinery or deliberate silence or forged documentation could change what was true when she stood in a trauma bay and someone needed her to know what she knew. She had always known it. She just had to stop apologizing.